In this lesson, we're going to see how to work with colours in SVG. We'll see how you can set up fill colours and stroke colours to specify how images should be filled and outlined. And then we'll see how to set up gradients and patterns. We'll see how to define linear gradients that move from one colour to another in a straight line. You can have any number of colours you like in a linear gradient. And then we'll see radial gradients where you specify a centre point and then you have a series of concentric circles that spin outwards from it using different colours. That gives you a nice solid effect when you've got spheres like so. And then we'll see how you can define patterns using images to fill shapes as well. That's the Welsh flag you can see there at the top of the cone. So let's get started and take a look at how to draw fills and strokes. In my SVG elements down here, we have 4 rectangles, and you can experiment with these if you want to yourself. The file is called workingwithcolors.html. It's on your project files folder. So the first rectangle has no fill or stroke specified, and by default that gives you a black interior with no outline. So the first rectangle has a black interior and no outline. Now the second rectangle does specify a fill color and stroke, but it sets fill to be none, and that means transparent. So the second rectangle has a transparent fill, so you can see the background of the SVG through the shape, and it has an outline of light blue, and the outline is set by the stroke property. Okay, moving on, the third rectangle shows a couple of more properties. First of all, I've given the stroke a wider width, so that's now 5 pixels wide, so that's 5 pixels width there. And a stroke opacity is 0.5, means 50% transparent, 50% opaque. Okay, 1.0 would have meant 100% opaque, 0 would have meant 100% transparent, 0.5 is half transparent, half opaque. So the stroke outline is 50% transparent there. Now on the last rectangle, we also specify a fill opacity. So the fill is 50% transparent. Okay, so you can see some of the greenness from the background shining through there. Also notice the dotted outline. And the way you achieve that is by using the stroke dash array property. It's a series of numbers which specify an on and an off type pattern. So this means 2 pixels on and then 2 pixels off. So we get a kind of 2 on, 2 off type dotted effect, like so. Now you can define any number of values you want here. So for example, I could have said 2, 2, 5, 5. And if I save that and then go into the browser and F5 to refresh the view and click the button again, what we see now is 2 pixels on, 2 off, 5 on, 5 off, and the pattern just repeats itself around the perimeter. Okay, I'll just put that back to what it was before. Now we'll have a look at the second part of this lesson, which looks at gradients and patterns. So I have 6 different shapes here. I have a polygon and an ellipse and a circle, and then a similar set of images on the right hand side. And we'll use a linear gradient that goes from yellow to green to red to fill in the cone. We'll use a radial gradient for the circle, and we'll fill in the ellipse here with an image. It's the Welsh flag. So let's see how to do that. So that's back into the code. This is on line 68. We have an SVG here. Now the important thing to note, when you're using linear gradients or patterns or radial gradients, in SVG there's an element called defs, which allows you to pre-declare objects that you're going to be using later. It's a bit like declaring variables in a normal programming language. So what I've done is I've set up 2 linear gradients. I've given one an ID of gradient 1a, and I've given the other one an ID of gradient 1b. You'll see why I've got 2 different linear gradients in a moment. I have a radial gradient, and I've given that one an ID of gradient 2, and then I have a pattern, and I've given that an ID of Wales. And these IDs matter because it's the IDs that allows you to use these objects later on. If you look at this code down here, this is where I've actually drawn the shapes on the left hand side. So I have a polygon, and the points represent a cone, and I've set the fill color to be a URL property. Now the URL function allows you to specify the ID of another object. This will pick up the gradient that I defined at the beginning, gradient 1a. It'll find that linear gradient, and it'll apply that linear gradient as the fill for this polygon. Okay, so use the URL function and give it the ID, using the hash symbol, give it the ID of the object you'd like to use as the filler. So in this example, that's going to be a linear gradient. Now for the ellipse, I give it the URL of Wales, and that was the pattern that picked up an image. So it picks up the ID there, Wales. And then for the circle uses gradient 2. And gradient 2 was that radial gradient that we passed over just a moment ago. And then I have a similar set of elements here, which draws the items on the right-hand side of the SVG. Now then, let's take a closer look at how to set these gradients up in the first place. Now there's an important point here. At the moment we're using gradient 1a, so I'll focus on this one at the moment. It really matters what you set for this property, gradient units. Gradient units could be object bounding box or user space on use. So this is the one we're using at the moment, so let's concentrate on that for now. When you say gradient units equals object bounding box, then the values you specify here are relative to the target element. So bearing in mind, this linear gradient applies to the cone, so it applies to this cone here. So these values are relative to that cone. So when we set x1, meaning the start point for the gradient, at 0%, it means right at the beginning of this cone. And then when we specify x2 as 100, it means right at the end of this cone. So it's always relative to this shape, not to the whole SVG, but to the actual shape that you're talking about. So we'll have a linear gradient here that will start at the top left-hand corner of the cone, and it'll end at the top right-hand corner of the cone. So the gradient will go from there to there. And during that gradient, you can specify any number of color stops that you like by using the stop element. The stop element specifies an offset. So for example, 0.2 means that 20% of the way along the gradient will be yellow. So 20% in, we have yellow. And then at 50%, we'll have green. So 50% of the way in, it becomes green. And then at the end of the color scheme, it'll be red. So at the end of the cone, it'll be red. Now then, because I've set the linear gradient to be object bounding box, this shape will have that gradient applied to it. This shape will have the gradient applied to it as well. Well, now let's see what happens if we use this linear gradient instead. This linear gradient is the same as the one before, except now we specified gradient units to be user space on use. And effectively that means the whole SVG element now defines the coordinate system. So when we specify x1 to be 0 and y1 to be 0, we're talking about the coordinates of the actual SVG element up here. So that now is going to be where the yellow color starts. And if you look at the offset of 1.0, at position 1.0, that'll be x2 of 600. So that means that 600 pixels from the left-hand side of the entire SVG, so that's way over here. At that point, we'll have red. So the gradient doesn't repeat itself for each shape, it's one gradient that goes across the whole width of the SVG, and you get quite a different effect. I'm going to prove that now. I'm going to set my cones to use gradient 1b instead of gradient 1a. So if I just come down here, and I change the first cone to be gradient 1b, and I'll do the same for the second one, and save that file. Go back into the browser and refresh the view with F5. Now see what happens when I apply the color scheme again. So we have yellow over here, and then it's sort of becoming green as we go across the whole canvas, and then it becomes red right at the end. So you get quite a different effect because the whole SVG now is applied to the color scheme as opposed to an individual element. Okay, so use whichever one you like. Object bounding box means just this element, and user space on use means the whole of the SVG. Okay, so that's the tricky part explained. Radial gradient is actually quite straightforward. I specified object bounding box, so that means for the circle that it gets applied to, 30% of the way into the circle horizontally and 30% of the way down, that's where the focal point will be for my radial gradient. And then we'll have at 0.1 we'll have a color stop of yellow, and then at 0.7 we'll have a color stop of red. So we have 30% of the way down and 30% of the way across. That's the focal point, and we have yellow at 0.2, and then at 1.0 we have red. Okay, so you get those concentric circles. You can define any number of color stops in your radial gradient. So the last thing is to see how to draw the pattern. To do that, you make use of the pattern element, give it an ID so you can refer to it later. Set the pattern units. That's the same idea as gradient units that we've been discussing. Give it a width and a height. And then this is the image that we want to draw. So we give it an href. This is the actual name of the image on the file system. So we use xlink href to indicate the URL of the image that we want to link in. And then we just give it some coordinates that define how that image is going to be applied. So the pattern has an ID of Wales, and then I apply that pattern to my two ellipses. So the first ellipse makes use of the Wales item. So the fill is set to the URL of Wales. So that's the Wales ID there. And then we've done the same for the second ellipse as well. So that concludes the lesson. We've seen how you can set the fill property and the stroke property, plus various others like stroke width and stroke dash array to define fills and strokes. And then we've seen how to define linear gradients, radial gradients, and patterns to give you a more interesting effect if you want it.